All right, so today we're kicking off something really special. This is part one of an 8-part miniseries that dives into a pretty groundbreaking new way of looking at reality itself. It's called liquid information. It's a huge idea, so let's ease into it with a pretty strange question.
I know, right? It sounds like the setup for a weird joke. On one hand, you have the chaotic, number-crunching world of financial trading, and on the other, you have the mystery of our own awareness. They seem worlds apart, but what if they aren't? What if the patterns, the actual mechanics running underneath both of them, share a deep, fundamental similarity? That's the question that got this whole ball rolling.
So, where on earth did an idea like this come from? Well, not from a university lab or a philosophy department. It actually came from a totally different, high-pressure arena, the world of financial trading. The author's background is in data analysis and day trading, a world that is nothing but pure, lightning-fast information. I mean, just think about it for a second. The markets are basically a massive, real-time experiment in human behavior. They forced you to swim in an ocean of data, to spot these subtle, repeating patterns, all while you're under intense pressure. And maybe most importantly, they force you to manage your own psychology, your own greed and fear. It turns out, this crazy environment was the perfect training ground for a much, much bigger insight. And what's really fascinating are the specific skills you develop in that kind of environment. You learn to see fractal patterns, the same shapes and behaviors that show up on a 5-minute chart and a 4-hour chart. You get incredibly good at separating the signal, what actually matters, from all the random noise. You become almost a professional at watching your own internal state. And, crucially, you learn to think in multiple flexible models at once, because if you get stuck on one rigid idea in the market, you're going to have a bad time. So the author has seen these patterns play out every single day. And then at some point, it just clicks. The very same dynamics, the same ebbs and flows he's seeing on the charts, are also happening inside our own minds. Let's take a look at what that actually means.
And this slide just lays it out perfectly. In the market, you have an accumulation range where the price just kind of goes sideways, building energy. Well, isn't that just like our own psychological holding patterns where we're stuck in a loop? Or how about compression, that tightening period before a massive move? It's the exact same feeling as that internal pressure building up right before we make a huge life change, a psychological breakout. And liquidity flows, the way money moves around the market, that's a perfect analogy for how our collective attention flows and creates trends.
So here's the kicker. The author realized this wasn't just a clever metaphor. No, this parallel pointed to something way deeper. It suggested that the basic rules, the actual mechanisms that govern these two systems, markets and minds, might actually be one and the same.
Now, that's a powerful idea. But was it just a cool coincidence? An interesting observation? This is where the story gets bigger. This is where the insight from the trading floor starts connecting with the work of other explorers, often unconventional ones, who are poking at the same ideas from totally different angles. And suddenly, all these different puzzle pieces start to snap into place. You had people like Itzhak Bentov, who described the mind and body as this vibrating resonant system. You had Robert Monroe, who was literally mapping out different states of consciousness based on frequency. Bob Proctor was talking all about emotional energy and intention. And then you even have game theory, which is all about how we adapt to informational pressures. They were all talking about the same core concepts: energy, information, flow, just using different vocabularies.
And you got to understand, many of these figures weren't your typical mainstream academics. But they weren't just making things up either. They were methodical explorers. They were pioneers, really, who were intuitively investigating these ideas of resonance, coherence, and frequency, things that modern science is only just now starting to get a real handle on.
So you've got market patterns on one side, you've got consciousness research on the other, you've got systems theory in the mix. All of these separate threads, they all start weaving together into one powerful, unifying idea. And that idea now has a name. This is it. This is the heart of the whole series, liquid information. The big idea is to stop thinking about information as something static, like individual bricks you stack up to build a wall of knowledge. Instead, this framework asks us to imagine information as a dynamic fluid, as a kind of informational ecosystem that's always flowing, always in motion. This comparison really makes it click. The old way of thinking sees information as separate little bricks, fixed, objective, stored in a specific place. But this new view sees it like water, a continuous field. It's not fixed. It actually responds to where we put our attention and energy. And just like water, it can flow smoothly, it can resonate, it can get turbulent, and it can form incredibly powerful currents.
Okay, so
This is obviously a huge concept, but what's it for? What's the point of having this new map of reality? Well, it's not about having some final answer to everything.
And this is a really, really important distinction to make. Liquid information isn't being presented as some final, absolute theory of everything. Think of it more like a tool. It's a conceptual bridge that's designed to connect different fields of thought that, for way too long, have been stuck in their own separate silos.
So, the whole mission here is to create a common ground. It's about unifying all these different insights into how consciousness works. It's about linking seemingly separate worlds like vibration, how we think, and yes, even financial markets. The idea is to build a shared language based on frequency so we can all start exploring that deep, deep relationship between our minds, the physical world, and how we find meaning in it all.
Which leaves us with the big question that's going to drive the rest of this series. If we really run with this idea, if we accept that information acts like a fluid, what does that mean for us, for our lives? How does learning to navigate this informational ocean shape our behavior, our awareness, and ultimately, our potential as human beings?
Hey, welcome back. This is part 2 of our 8-part deep dive into consciousness. Last time, we kind of set the stage. Today, we're getting into the really thorny question, why is this so incredibly hard to figure out? I mean, really think about that for a second. We've accomplished these just monumental scientific feats. We've mapped the billions of connections in the human brain. We've decoded the entire human genome. And yet the one thing that's with us every single second of our lives, our own awareness, is still pretty much a black box. So why is that?
Okay, so let's get into it. The first huge problem is that the study of consciousness is completely fragmented. You see, it's not one big project. It's more like a bunch of different teams, all staring at a giant puzzle, but they're all in separate rooms. They have different tools, they speak different languages, they're not working together.
So, in the first room, you've got the neuroscientists. You can think of them as the electricians. Their job is to map out the physical hardware of the brain, all the neurons, the synapses, the electrical pulses zipping around. And what's fascinating is that neuroscience is amazing at telling us the what and the when. It can show you a brain scan and say, see that? That's the part of your brain that lights up when you see the color red. But it has absolutely no answer for how a bunch of electrical signals and chemicals creates the actual feeling, the subjective experience of redness. That right there is the famous hard problem of consciousness. All right, let's go to the next room. Here we have the psychologists. Now, they're not looking at the wiring, they're looking at the software. They study our behaviors, our thoughts, our emotions, all to try and figure out the patterns of the mind. And don't get me wrong, psychology gives us these fantastic models for understanding how we think and act, but here's the issue. A lot of these models are pretty abstract. They give us a great blueprint for the software, but they often don't explain how that software is actually running on the physical hardware of the brain. That connection is often missing. Now for our third group, the philosophers. They're taking a totally different approach. They're not focused on the brain or behavior, but on the experience itself, that what it's like feeling of being you. They're the ones who give us the language to even talk about this stuff with any kind of precision. So, the crucial thing here is that philosophy gives us the vocabulary. It helps us describe our inner worlds. But, and this is a big but, it's not science in the traditional sense. You can't really test a philosophical argument in a lab, right? And that makes it really, really hard to connect with what the neuroscientists and psychologists are going. And finally, there's a perspective that's been around for thousands of years, but that science has, well, mostly ignored. And that's the wisdom from contemplative and spiritual traditions. For millennia, they've been working with ideas like vibration and frequency, using tools like meditation to directly work with consciousness. I mean, think about it. For centuries, practices like chanting or deep breathing have been used to change someone's state of mind. And for a long time, this was dismissed. But now, science is actually starting to catch up. We're exploring things like rhythmic entrainment and seeing how these ancient techniques have very real, measurable effects on our brainwaves. It seems like they were onto something all along. And this table just lays it all out perfectly, doesn't it? We've got these 4 different camps. Neuroscience has the wiring, psychology has the patterns, philosophy has the experience, and spirituality has the energetics. They each have a piece of the puzzle, but as you can see, they're all missing the same thing, a single unifying theory that actually connects all the dots.
But you know what? The problem is even deeper than just these separate fields not talking to each other. The issue might go all the way down to the very foundations of how we think. The basic assumptions we're using to study consciousness. They might be wrong from the start.
Okay, so here's flaw number 1. Most of our scientific models are built on the idea of the brain as a computer. It takes in data, processes it in discrete little bits, zeros and ones. But just ask yourself, is that what your inner life feels like? A sequence of data points? No way. Our experience is a constant, dynamic, messy, beautiful flow. It's much more like a river than a computer.
Which brings us to a second huge blind spot: frequency and resonance. And like this quote says, this isn't some new age idea, it's ancient wisdom. Cultures all over the world knew that sound and rhythm weren't just for fun. They were technologies for tuning your inner state, for physically changing how your brain and body operate. And the third major flaw is a problem of scale. We tend to focus on things that happen in our brain from second to second. We understand daily circadian rhythm, sure, but we pretty much ignore the bigger, slower cycles, like the lunar cycle. I mean, we know it has a massive gravitational effect on our planet's oceans. Is it really a stretch to think it might have a subtle effect on us too? Now you might be thinking, come on, the moon's effect has got to be tiny. And day to day, maybe it is. But what happens when you zoom out? What seems like a tiny little nudge could become a massive shaping force over the course of an entire lifetime, or even over millions of years of evolution. It's like trying to understand a canyon by looking at one grain of sand. You're missing the big picture.
So when you put all of this together, the isolated disciplines, the bad assumption about information, the blind spots for frequency and scale, you start to see the real problem with how we're trying to study this.
And here it is, the core issue. Our scientific method is incredible at taking things apart and analyzing them when they're sitting still. We can analyze a static object, but consciousness isn't an object. It's a process. It's a dynamic flow.
And this is really the best way to think about it. Right now, all our scientific methods are basically just taking snapshots of a flowing river. And we can analyze each snapshot in incredible detail. We can describe the molecules, the currents, the riverbed, but we are completely, utterly missing the most essential quality of the river, the fact that it flows.
So that leaves us with this really exciting question. What if the problem isn't that consciousness is unexplainable? What if the problem is just that our tools are wrong for the job? What if we need a whole new kind of science, a framework designed from the ground up to describe things that are fluid, interconnected, and constantly in motion? And that's exactly where we're headed next.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack a really fascinating way to think about your own mind as its own internal social media feed.
Now, this is part 3 of our mini-series, so if you're just jumping in, we're exploring a whole new framework for how consciousness works.
All right, let's just dive right in with a pretty wild idea. What if the endless scroll, the recommendation algorithm, the viral outrage? What if Silicon Valley didn't invent any of that? What if all they really did was build a machine that perfectly mirrors the process that's already running inside your head?
To really get our heads around that claim, we first have to understand the core concept from the source material. It's an idea called liquid information. So here's the big shift in thinking. Instead of imagining your mind as a computer, with neat files and folders, I want you to picture it more like a river. It's this constantly moving, shifting field of information. Your thoughts, your memories, your feelings, they aren't static things. They're just patterns forming and dissolving in this dynamic flow.
And this is where it gets really interesting. This flow isn't just one steady speed. Depending on your mental state, that information can speed way up, like when you're feeling anxious, or it can slow right down and pool, like when you're lost in deep thought. It can get choppy and fragmented, or it can stabilize into this really clear, coherent stream. And this is happening every single moment.
So what directs this flow? What creates the currents and eddies? Emotion. In this model, emotions aren't some kind of bug in the system that messes with your rational thought. No, they are the fundamental forces, kind of like gravity or the wind, that actually steer the river of your consciousness. Fear can make a thought accelerate and get all turbulent, while calm allows that information to flow smoothly. Emotion is literally the architect of your mind. Okay, so now that we have that foundation, consciousness as a fluid directed by emotion, let's bring back that social media analogy and see how your internal feed actually works. And this is where it all just snaps into focus. Think about it. On social media, you scroll to see what's next. Well, in your mind, your attention is the scroll. It determines what information you're looking at. The likes and shares that tell the algorithm what's important, that's your emotion. Your memories, that's the massive data archive. And your brain's constant process of predicting what's about to happen, that's the recommendation engine, serving up what it thinks you need to see. Yeah, just
let that one hang in the air for a second. Just like your social feed isn't the entire internet, your conscious awareness isn't the whole of reality. It's a highly curated, deeply personalized stream of information that your own internal algorithm has decided is important for you right now.
So what is our internal algorithm value? What's the currency? While a social media platform is hunting for likes and shares, your brain is optimizing for something way more primal. It pushes anything with high emotional intensity to the top, anything relevant to your survival, any thought that reinforces your sense of who you are, and crucially, anything that's uncertain or unresolved. That's the stuff that gets top billing in your mental feed.
And this really gets to the heart of it. Your brain's #1 job isn't to be a philosopher, seeking objective truth. It's a survival machine. So an emotionally impactful thought, a flash of fear, a jolt of anger, gets prioritized because, hey, that could be a threat or maybe an opportunity. Whether it's true or not is a secondary concern to its immediate impact.
And just like on social media, this system creates these powerful self-reinforcing feedback loops. The more you pay attention to an anxious thought, the more emotional charge it gets. That emotion acts as an engagement signal that tells your brain, hey, this is important, show me more like this. And the brain does. And pretty soon, your entire perception of the world can start to reshape itself around that one recurring idea.
So the takeaway here is that your reality isn't just something that happens to you. It's something you are actively co-creating, moment by moment, just by where you choose to place your attention. Where your attention flows, your reality grows.
Now, this internal algorithm is incredibly fast, and it's super efficient at sorting all this information by its impact. But it makes you wonder, right? In the flow of your own mind, is faster always better?
This is such a critical distinction. On one hand, you have viral information, which is basically mental clickbait. These are the intrusive thoughts, the catchy anxieties, the oversimplified stories that spread like wildfire through your mind. They're fast, they're noisy, but they shatter your attention. And on the other hand, you have coherent information. This is the stuff that's integrated, meaningful, and actually builds a stable, deep understanding of the world.
This is such a powerful thing to remember. The loudest, fastest thought in your head is not necessarily the most important one or the truest one. An intrusive worry can feel incredibly urgent, but that urgency is just a measure of its emotional charge, not its actual validity. And when we get trapped in these viral feedback loops over and over again, we can literally build an internal echo chamber inside our own heads. It's not just a problem on social media. It creates what the source calls a frozen flow pattern in the mind, where your thinking gets defensive, your identity gets rigid, and curiosity just gets replaced by certainty. Okay, I know what you might be thinking. This all sounds a little bleak, right? Like we're just passengers trapped inside our own algorithmic minds. But this is where the whole thing pivots, from just understanding the mechanism to actually taking control of it. Let's talk about becoming your own algorithm. This, right here, is the single most empowering message of this whole explainer. The goal isn't to try and escape the algorithm or shut it down. That's impossible. The goal is to become aware of it, to see it running, to notice the patterns in your own mental feed, and to realize, maybe for the first time, that you have a choice in what you engage with. So how do you actually do that? You start editing the algorithm. You can consciously choose to change your attention habits. You can practice emotional regulation to change the very forces that steer your thoughts. You can curate your environment to control your inputs, and you can be deliberate about the information you consume, your mental diet. You retrain the algorithm by changing what you feed it. Which leaves us with one last pretty profound question. This whole framework suggests that you are not just a passive observer of your own reality. You are the curator. You are the editor. You are the algorithm itself. So, knowing that, what reality are you going to choose to create? Hello and welcome back. This is part 4 of our 8-part mini-series, and today we're going to dive into a really cool concept called liquid information. We're going to completely reframe how you think about your senses and the reality they're actually creating for you. Okay, let's just jump right in with a big provocative question. We all tend to trust our senses, right? We think they're these perfect windows looking out onto the world. But what if that's not what they do at all? What if they're actually building the world you experience? Let's dig in. So in this first section, we're going to challenge that common everyday understanding of our senses. We're going to stop seeing them as passive receivers and start looking at them as active, powerful constructors of your world. Now this slide really shows the huge paradigm shift we're talking about. The old view is super simple, right? Eyes see, ears hear. What you see is what you get.
But this new view, the one from the liquid information framework, is way more dynamic. It suggests your senses are actually translators. They're taking all these external frequencies, like light and sound, and converting them into electrical signals your brain can make sense of. They aren't just showing you reality. They're literally building a version of it just for you.
So here's the core idea, the liquid information framework. It basically proposes that everything, the light in your room, the music you're listening to, even the food you eat, it all gets converted into neural oscillations. In other words, brainwaves. And it's these internal signals that are directly shaping how you feel, how you focus, and even what you're capable of thinking at any given moment.
And this really gets to the heart of it. The big takeaway here is that your environment is constantly tuning your internal state, whether you're paying attention or not. Every little signal matters because it all gets mixed together to create the final picture of your reality.
Okay, so let's get practical and see how this actually works. We're going to start with light, which is probably one of the most powerful and most overlooked types of information we get. It's not just there so we can see, it's there to send signals.
I love this quote because it's just so direct. The kind of light you're in is sending a direct command to your nervous system. It's changing its baseline frequency, and it's influencing what kind of thoughts and feelings are going to come more easily to you in that moment.
All right, let's break this down. As you can see here, different wavelengths of light are carrying totally different instructions. You've got that short wavelength blue light, from our screens, that boosts alertness and helps with analytical focus. It's great for problem solving. Then in the middle, you've got green light, which is more calming and emotionally balancing, perfect for creative work. And finally, that long wavelength red or warm light, that's the signal for safety and relaxation, ideal for winding down at the end of the day.
And it's not just about the color of the light. The actual structure of what you're looking at is a huge deal. A cluttered desk, a chaotic website, that creates a ton of cognitive noise, and it forces your brain to work way harder. But a clean, structured environment, that actually helps your brain because it doesn't have to work so hard to predict what's coming next. You could say visual simplicity isn't just an aesthetic choice. It's a form of cognitive kindness to yourself.
Okay, next up is sound. If light is an instruction, you can think of sound as a modulator. And what's so wild about sound is its ability to just bypass our rational thinking and influence us on a much deeper, more immediate level than even our vision.
This is so incredibly true, isn't it? You don't get to decide if that jackhammer outside is going to affect your nervous system. It just does. Sound directly tunes your cognitive and emotional state, for better or for worse. And this chart here breaks it down beautifully. Rhythmic, predictable sounds, like some electronic music or binaural beats, can literally pull your brainwaves into a pattern and stabilize your attention. Then you've got more complex harmonic sounds, like classical music, that can support creativity. And then there's chaotic sound. Notifications, people talking over each other. That stuff actively fragments your attention and jacks up your stress levels.
All right, now for our third input, and honestly, this might be one of the most important reframes in this whole framework: food. We really have to move beyond thinking of food as just fuel and start seeing it for what it is: complex biological information.
So the old view is just all about calories, right? Calories in, calories out. But the liquid information perspective, as you see here, is so much more sophisticated. It's not about the quantity of energy, it's about the quality of the information. Every single bite you take has micronutrients and mineral ratios and all these compounds that send very specific signals to your cells and, of course, to your brain.
And that's the bottom line. The quality of your thoughts, your mood, your ability to focus, it's directly tied to the chemical building blocks you give your brain through your diet. You are literally building your consciousness from your last meal.
So what this means is we can get really strategic. This isn't about some rigid one-size-fits-all diet. It's about alignment. If you need a few hours of deep focus, then a meal that gives you stable blood glucose and some good amino acids is key. If you're trying to get into a creative flow, maybe you want lighter meals and great hydration. The whole goal is to match the informational input to your intended output.
Okay, so we've looked at light, sound, and food all by themselves, but this is where it all comes together. The real magic, the real power, happens when you start to align these inputs. That's when you get this incredible compounding effect.
So imagine you start by setting up your environment with the right lighting for what you need to do. Let's say some cool blue light to prime your brain for analysis.
And then you layer on a soundscape that supports that same mental state. Maybe it's some rhythmic electronic music that helps stabilize your attention.
And finally, you've eaten a meal that gives your brain the exact biochemical signals it needs to perform, keeping your blood sugar steady and your mind totally clear.
And what's the result? Effortless cognition. When all the information coming in is pointing in the same direction, your nervous system it stops fighting itself. That internal friction just vanishes, and high performance simply emerges on its own.
And that, right there, is the ultimate payoff. Instead of using willpower and just brute force to get through your day, you create an environment where being productive is the most natural, unavoidable outcome. So let's be super clear. This isn't about micromanaging every little variable or chasing some impossible idea of perfection. The core philosophy here is alignment over optimization. It's not about forcing an outcome. It's about removing the noise, supporting your body's natural coherence, and just letting your system do what it already evolved to do.
And we'll end on this powerful idea. It's a simple but really profound mantra to take away with you. If you consciously align the information in your environment, your mind will naturally follow. It will lead you to a state of greater focus, creativity, and wealth.
Welcome back. You're here for part 5 of our mini-series on new models of the mind. So far, we've talked a lot about the how of performance. But today we are going deep on the what.
Okay, let's jump right in. The big idea for today is something called liquid information. And the core concept is this. What if consciousness isn't a thing inside your head, but is actually a dynamic, flowing field of information? Just that one little shift in how you think about it has absolutely massive implications for how we think, how we feel, and you guessed it, how we perform.
So here's our game plan. First, we're going to tear down the old model of consciousness and build up this new idea of flow. Then we'll look at how our emotions and senses are not just experiencing reality, but are actively creating it. And finally, we'll get really practical and talk about how you can actually harness this flow for peak performance, and even what role something like AI might play in all this.
All right, let's get to it. We're going to start by really challenging a belief that's been around for centuries. This idea of the mind is some kind of machine. But what if that mechanical model is the very thing that's holding us back?
Okay, so check this out. On the left, you've got the old way of thinking. Consciousness is a box, a container. It just holds stuff like thoughts and memories. It's static. But look at the model on the right. This is a total game changer. Here, consciousness is a dynamic, fluid field. It's a living, self-organizing system that's constantly moving and changing. It doesn't just hold information, it is the flow of information.
And this brings us right to the core definition, liquid information. Think of it like this. Your consciousness is a field of information that acts a lot like water. It can flow smoothly, it can get choppy and turbulent, or it can settle into these really stable, coherent patterns. And here's why that matters. It means you don't optimize your mind with brute force. You do it by creating alignment, by creating resonance within this field.
So, if consciousness is this flowing field, what's steering the current? Well, one of the most powerful forces is something we all deal with every single second of every day: our emotions.
Take a look at this phrase on the screen, dimensional modulator. I mean, that sounds like something out of science fiction, right? But it's a really powerful way to think about it. In this model, your emotions aren't just a side effect of your thoughts. No, they are the primary architects of your reality. They act like a filter that decides what information even gets your attention, and they literally change how deep or rich your experience of the world feels.
And you can feel the difference. On one hand, when you're in a coherent state, feeling calm, focused, in the zone, information just flows. Ideas connect, you see the bigger picture. But on the other hand, when you're in a dysregulated state, like feeling anxious or angry, look what happens. The information shatters. It gets chaotic. You get stuck in these frustrating mental loops.
So, our emotions are shaping our inner world. But what about the outside world coming in? We tend to think our eyes and ears are just clear windows, giving us a perfect picture of what's out there. But this framework says, not even close.
Think about it this way. Your senses are not passive windows. They are active translators. They take all the raw data of the universe, light waves, sound waves, pressure, and they convert it into the only language your brain understands, neural oscillations. Those oscillations are what create the informational field that you experience as reality. So you're not seeing the world as it is, you're seeing the world as you reconstruct.
You can actually see this happen over your own lifetime. When we're kids, our informational field is just incredibly fluid, right? Less rigid. It's why imagination is so powerful. But as we get older, those patterns in the flow, they stabilize. They have to for us to function efficiently in the world. We get better at doing specific things, but the trade-off is that we often lose some of that access to the more fluid, creative ways of seeing things.
Okay, so this is all super interesting, but here's the big question. How do we actually use this stuff? How do we take this idea of a fluid information field and use it to our advantage? Well, the secret is all about alignment. Let me just ask you a question. Think about where you are right now. The light in your room, any background noise, the clutter or lack of it on your desk. Do you think those little, seemingly tiny things actually make a real difference in how you think and perform?
The answer is a massive, resounding yes. When all those small inputs are pointed in the same direction, when they're aligned with what you're trying to do, their effect isn't just 1 + 1 + 1. It's compounding. They all work together to quiet the noise in your informational field, letting your mind flow with way less friction.
And this, right here, is what elite performers do, whether they know it or not. They are masters at protecting their informational coherence. They obsess over their nutrition, their schedules, their sensory environments. They aren't just trying harder than everyone else. They're strategically removing all those little bits of friction that drain mental energy, which frees up a huge amount of cognitive power.
Now, you might be thinking, that's great, but I don't have a personal chef and a huge support team. And in the past, that was a fair point. That kind of environmental control was a luxury. But today, technology is changing the game for all of us.
I want you to think of AI as a form of cognitive scaffolding. It can do for us what that support team does for an athlete. It can handle the repetitive, brain-draining tasks. It can help us plan and organize. It can even suggest those sensory alignments we talked about. It basically reduces the cognitive tax of modern life so we can keep our own informational field clear and coherent.
So let's make this super practical. Just look at this table. This isn't about some rigid one-size-fits-all set of rules. It's about consciously matching your environment to your goal. If you need to do focused work, you see here it suggests cool light and consistent sounds. But if you want to be creative, maybe try some warmer light and more ambient audio. And for rest, you dial everything down. Each choice is about curating your informational field to support the state you want to be in.
And really, this is what it all comes down to. This is the big shift. We spend so much of our lives trying to force our way to better performance, just pushing through with sheer willpower. But this whole framework tells us there's a much smarter way. Optimization doesn't come from force. It comes from coherence.
And here it is. This is the ultimate takeaway. When you get all the pieces working together, your senses, your emotions, your environment, and what you're trying to do, something incredible happens. Peak performance stops being this thing you have to struggle for. It just emerges, naturally, fluidly. And a lot of the time, without you even having to think about it. The system just organizes itself for success.
Welcome back. So, for the past few episodes, we've been on this incredible journey exploring the what if of the liquid information framework. Well, today, we're asking how. This is part 6 of our 8-part series, and we are officially moving from the purely theoretical to the practical. We're going to look at the actual concrete experiments designed to test this groundbreaking idea.
Right, so just as a quick refresher, the framework puts forward a pretty wild idea. What if our thoughts, our health, even our societies all operate on the same basic principles of informational flow and coherence? You can think of it like tuning an old-school radio. The clearer the signal, the better the music. But how on earth do you even begin to prove something like that?
Here's the roadmap for today. We're going to start small, at the personal level, looking at the body as a kind of biological antenna. Then we'll scale up to how we can tune our minds with machines. From there, we'll get into the really cool stuff, engineering group intelligence. And finally, we'll zoom all the way out to see if we can decode the patterns of history itself, all to build towards one unified vision.
Okay, so first up, let's treat the human body like a biological receiver. The core question here is actually pretty simple, but it's also incredibly profound. Can we measurably tune our internal state, our actual consciousness, with the right kind of informational inputs?
Let's begin with something every single one of us does every single day: eating. The very first experiment completely reframes diet. It's not just about calories for fuel. It's about bioinformational modulation. It's asking a simple question: does the quality of the information in our food literally change the quality of our thoughts?
So here's the setup. It's a proposed controlled trial. You've got Group 1, and they get a diet of whole foods, things like fresh plants and ethically raised animals. The framework calls this high-integrity information. Then you've got Group 2. They get the ultra-processed stuff, packaged foods, refined sugars, which is essentially low-coherence information. You can think of it as just static or informational noise for your body.
And check this out. The measurements go way beyond just weight or cholesterol. The experiment would actually track brainwave synchrony with an EEG, measure the balance and resilience of your nervous system through heart rate variability, and even test creative problem-solving skills. So the real question becomes, can a clean diet literally make you a more coherent, insightful thinker? And the prediction? Well, the hypothesis is that the whole food group would show way higher brain coherence and just flat-out better cognitive performance. If that holds true, it would be powerful evidence that what you put in your mouth directly tunes your entire cognitive and physiological system.
And it doesn't stop with food. Other experiments on this personal scale would look at using specific frequencies of light to boost your focus or creativity. Or, get this, using rhythmic sounds like binaural beats to actually get your brain hemispheres in sync, which could potentially boost memory and give you more of those aha moments of insight.
So from there, we level up. We go from just passively receiving information to actively managing it. And this, of course, brings us to the fascinating interaction between our minds and our machines. What happens when we use technology to filter out the overwhelming noise of the modern world?
I want you to imagine a really high-stress job, okay? Like an emergency dispatcher or a stock trader. In this experiment, one group gets what they usually get, a raw, unfiltered fire hose of data coming at them. But the other group? They get an AI-powered coherence filter. It's an AI that's actively highlighting what's important, suppressing the noise, and giving critical context. It's basically an AI acting as a cognitive stabilizer.
So how would we even know if it's working? Well, we could measure the brain's cognitive load directly with an EEG to see how hard it's working. We could track physiological stress levels by measuring skin conductivity. That's the galvanic skin response. And of course, the bottom line, we'd score the accuracy of the decisions they make under all that pressure. The implication here is just huge. If this experiment works as predicted, it would show that AI could be so much more than a simple productivity tool. It could actually become an external amplifier for our own mental clarity, helping us think better and make smarter decisions in a world that just keeps getting more complex.
Okay, now let's zoom out again. We've looked at the individual. But what happens when you apply these same principles of informational coherence not just to one person, but to an entire group? Is it possible to actually engineer collective intelligence?
So this next experiment, it tackles a very, very modern problem, this social media feed. Imagine two groups, both asked to solve a complex problem together, but they're getting their information from two totally different platforms. One gets a coherence-optimized feed. It's balanced, it's verified, it's logical. The other group gets the feed we're all a bit too familiar with, one that's engagement-optimized, meaning it's designed to be sensational and provoke an emotional reaction.
Now, the metrics for this are just fascinating. Researchers would actually measure if the group's heart rhythms literally start to sync up, a sign of deep rapport. They'd also track how long it takes them to agree on something and have outside experts rate the quality of their final solution. The whole point is to see if a coherent information feed helps people not just feel more aligned, but actually think better together. What an experiment like this aims to prove is that the very architecture of our digital spaces, how the information flows, is a primary factor in whether a group becomes smarter together or just becomes a dysfunctional mess. And that has massive implications for how we design our entire online world. All right, for our final set of experiments, we are taking the biggest leap of all. We're moving from a small group in a lab to the grand, sweeping story of human history. The question is, can the liquid information framework help us decode the rise and fall of entire civilizations?
I mean, that is the central audacious question, isn't it? The proposal is to use large-scale computational analysis. We're talking combing through millions of digitized books, legal documents, journals, to actually measure the informational health of a society over centuries.
And here's where we see the core hypothesis in action. The theory predicts a really clear pattern, a period of high semantic coherence, a time when a society's ideas are clear, consistent, and well-argued, is followed, maybe a decade or two later, by a huge burst of innovation and progress. In other words, coherence comes first, and then creation follows.
So as we start to bring all of these threads together, what does it all really mean? From your diet to your digital tools, from how your team works together to the grand flow of history, these experiments aren't just disconnected ideas. They're all designed to build toward a single, unified new science.
This research pipeline really is a journey.
It starts with you, at the personal level, literally tuning your own system. It then expands to the social level, showing us how we can design better ways to think together. And it culminates at the civilizational level, offering a totally new lens to understand our past and, maybe, just maybe, help shape our future. The ultimate goal is nothing less than a unified science of consciousness itself.
Which, of course, leaves us with this one final provocative thought. If these experiments, all of them, actually hold up, it suggests that information isn't just something we consume or create. It might just be the fundamental language of reality itself, and learning to speak that language fluently could be the most important skill we ever develop.
All right, let's dive into something pretty cool today. What if getting what you want in life isn't about some kind of magic or wishful thinking, but actually about managing the information that flows around you? Today, we're breaking down a framework called liquid information, and it's all about seeing your life less like a fixed path and more like a market that you can actively influence. So let's start with the big one, right? The question we've all wondered about: can you literally just think your way to success? You know, the whole idea that if you just want something bad enough, the universe will deliver it. It's a super popular idea, but what if the real process is less about magic and, honestly, a lot more powerful?
And that's exactly where we're headed. We're going to ditch the mystical crystal ball idea and replace it with something much more practical. A bustling marketplace, an information market, where you're not just some bystander hoping for the best, you are an active trader, a key player.
So here's our game plan for today. First, we'll get past all that mystical attraction stuff. Then we'll define what this information market really is. After that, we're going to look at a really important pitfall called the capacity collapse, then talk about how to forge your alignment to avoid it. And finally, we'll completely redefine what it means to be lucky.
Okay, first things first. Let's move beyond this idea of mystical attraction. If it's not some kind of cosmic delivery service, then how in the world does your mind actually shape the reality you experience day to day?
Okay, this is the crucial shift. Think of your attention like a spotlight. It doesn't magically pull things out of thin air and bring them to you. No. What it does is shine a bright light on certain parts of your world. It makes specific ideas, certain people, and new opportunities impossible for you to miss. And by doing that, it completely shapes the landscape you operate in and, of course, the actions you end up taking.
And that idea, it leads us right into the heart of this whole thing, seeing your life as a dynamic information market. When you start thinking this way, everything changes. You move from being a passive passenger of fate to an active driver in your own personal economy.
I mean, just look at the contrast here. Fate makes you feel like you're just a character in a story that's already been written. You're a passive recipient. But a market is alive. It's dynamic. It's responsive. It actually reacts to what you do, to your focus, your energy, your actions. You suddenly become an active participant. You're shaping the economy of your own life.
And this totally reframes what we even mean by an outcome. It's not some prize you manifest and then it's yours forever. No, it's a state you have to enter into. Think about it, like being physically fit or running a great business. That's a state you have to prepare for, build the capacity to even handle, and then work every single day to sustain.
But that whole building capacity thing is so important because there's a huge danger lurking in this market. It's called the capacity collapse, and it answers the question, what happens when you get exactly what you want, but way too soon? We've all heard the stories, right? The lottery winner who's broke in 2 years. The startup that gets a massive round of funding and then just implodes. They got the outcome they were dreaming of, but it came down on them like an avalanche, way before they'd built the foundation to support all that weight. And this is what that looks like. You get this huge, massive spike, the sudden gain. But without the systems, the experience, the mental foundation to handle it, it's just completely unstable. And what often happens is a rapid, painful collapse that can leave you even worse off than when you started.
This right here is the absolute key. The problem was never a lack of desire. They wanted it, for sure. The problem was a lack of capacity, the ability to absorb, manage, and grow that success. You really do have to build a container before you try to fill it.
So you can see there are two very different roads to growth here. The first is that destabilizing path, a huge gain that just leads to collapse. But the second, the stable path, well, it's a much more gradual process. You're accumulating knowledge, you're adjusting to small wins and losses, and you're patiently building the readiness to handle real success when it finally shows up.
Okay, so if capacity is the name of the game, how do we actually build it?
How do we forge that internal alignment that gets us ready for the success we're working toward?
So for most of us, let's be real, this is our default setting. This is a normal day. Our attention, our mental energy is just fragmented. It's split between work obligations, social media distractions, unresolved stuff in the back of our minds, and just plain old autopilot routines. And when your energy is this scattered, building any real, sustainable momentum is pretty much impossible.
Now contrast that with this. This is the high performer model. And look, this isn't about ignoring your life or your responsibilities. It's about intentional, temporary prioritization. For a set period, your attention is deliberately channeled, funneling almost all of your cognitive resources toward one single goal. This is how capacity gets built.
So how do you get there? Well, you could call it a kind of intentional obsession. You deliberately narrow your focus. You commit to small, consistent actions every single day that build up that readiness. And this last part is so crucial. You have to act from a place of clarity, not from stress. Because chronic stress, it just shatters your attention right back into that fragmented state. And all of this brings us to our final piece of the puzzle, where we tie everything together and totally redefine what we think of as luck. This is the big shift in thinking. We're swapping out mystical attraction for intentional alignment. And we're trading the idea of random luck for something way more empowering, prepared perception. It's about moving from a state of passive wishing to one of active building.
So what is this prepared perception? It's that state you get to when your mind has been so consistently focused on one thing that it starts to automatically filter the entire world for you. The right information, the right opportunities, they don't just magically appear. The truth is, you've trained your perception to finally see what was probably there all along.
And this is the line to burn into your memory. What looks like attraction is really alignment. And what looks like sheer luck is almost always prepared perception. The next time you see someone who seems to be incredibly lucky, just ask yourself, are you maybe just seeing someone who did the deep, quiet, consistent work of preparing their mind to see the opportunities that everyone else is blind to?
So I'll leave you with this question to think about. In the massive, chaotic information market of your own life, your attention is the most valuable currency you have. It's the only one that really matters. So where are you investing it?
All right, let's jump right in. We're going to talk about something pretty wild today, a concept that's totally flipping the script on what it means to be human in this digital world. This really gets to the core of who we are.
So, this is part 7 of our 8-part series on the liquid information framework. And after all the talk about systems and data, today we're turning the lens on the biggest piece of the puzzle, ourselves.
Okay, so think about this for a second. How do you see your own identity? Is it like a solid statue, carved in stone? Something fixed, stable with one main story? Or is it something completely different? Maybe something more fluid, constantly adapting, kind of like a process that's always in motion. For most of history, our sense of self was pretty straightforward. It was like a big, heavy anchor. It kept us grounded, gave us a really solid idea of who we were and where we fit in.
I mean, just think about it. Your identity was built from these really stable, slow-moving pieces. Where you were from, your family's culture, your job, your role in the community, that was you. It all added up to one clear life story. And to change any of that, man, that wasn't something you did in a lifetime. It could take generations.
But then, everything started to speed up, a lot. Information began to flow like never before. And that solid ground, that anchor of identity, it started to melt, to liquefy.
And this slide really shows you what that looks like. It's this insane compression of time. Think about it. Change that used to take generations for a society to absorb, then started happening in decades, then just a few years. And now it's happening in real time. It's constant. And we, our sense of self, we're right in the middle of it trying to keep up.
And this quote really nails the core idea. The source material is basically saying, look, identity isn't that fixed story we write about ourselves anymore. It's more like fluid code. Just think of that. Code that's being rewritten in real time by every bit of information and feedback that hits us.
Okay, so if we're not that solid statue anymore, what are we? What does this new liquid human actually look like? Let's break down the anatomy of it.
All right, first up is this idea of continuous updating. So instead of thinking of yourself as a finished product, like a book that's already written, the liquid self is more like an open system. It's a process. It's constantly evolving, constantly optimizing with new info. Kind of like your phone's operating system, right? Always getting updates to work better.
But okay, I know what you might be thinking. There's this common fear, right? That if we rely on all this tech, if we're this connected, we're just outsourcing our brains. Are we making ourselves dumber? Are we getting weaker by offloading all our thinking? Is that really what's going on here?
Well, the source material argues the complete opposite. It introduces this really cool concept, neo-symbiotic cognition. And the idea is that our ability to act, our human agency, it isn't shrinking at all. It's expanding. Think about it. When you use your phone for directions, you're not dumber. You've just freed up all that mental energy you would have spent on navigating to, I don't know, actually notice the world around you or think about your destination. The line between our mind and our tools is blurring, and it's making us a more powerful, combined system.
So what you get is what the paper calls a distributed self, and it's super flexible. Those old-school labels like your job title or your nationality, they don't define you in the same way. You can be one person on Twitter, another on LinkedIn, and yet another with your gaming friends, and it all feels coherent. The source actually has a term for this, multi-self coherence. It's this ability to hold all these different identities without feeling like you're falling apart. And get this, the research actually suggests this makes us happier and more creative.
Okay, so let's zoom out. Why does any of this matter? This whole shift to a liquid self. Is this good for us? Is this an advantage as we head into the future?
Well, according to the source, this isn't random at all. It's actually a critical evolutionary step. Being liquid is like a new superpower for our species. It's what lets us handle the insane complexity of the world today. It's what helps us adapt to constant, rapid change. It unlocks creativity, and yeah, as we just mentioned, it seems to be good for our well-being in this crazy, volatile world.
So look, the key takeaway here is that our self isn't being lost. It's not dissolving into nothing. It's just changing its form. It's being redefined. Who we are is becoming this emergent property, something that just arises from this constant fluid dance between our biology, our tech, and our culture. We're becoming these dynamic, adaptive systems perfectly built for a much more complex reality.
And that leaves us with one last, pretty deep question to chew on. If your identity isn't a destination, not something you finally figure out, but instead it's just this continuous flowing process, what does that mean for who you are becoming right now?
Hello and welcome back. This is it, the final installment in our 8-part mini-series on the liquid information framework. We've been deep in the weeds, but today we're zooming all the way out.
Yep, we're looking at the big picture. The rhythm of civilizations, why they rise and fall, and what this incredible accelerating force of artificial intelligence could mean for all of us. Okay, let's get right into it.
So here's the massive question, right? Is there a pattern to history? Well, the framework we've been talking about says yes, absolutely. But it's not just random chance. The core idea is that these cycles are driven by something the source material calls informational coherence.
To really get a handle on where we might be heading, we first have to look back. So let's start there. Let's explore what ingredients come together to make a civilization hit its absolute peak.
Okay, informational coherence. What does that even mean? Well, think of it like a moment when everything just clicks into place. It's when a society's flow of information, its sense of unity, and its actual physical capabilities all sync up perfectly. And when that happens, you get this massive boost in collective brain power, a surge in what the framework calls our cognitive bandwidth.
And you see this pattern in all the great civilizational highs. The European Renaissance, the Islamic Golden Age. These weren't just lucky accidents. The source argues they all shared these fundamental traits: super efficient ways to share knowledge, a powerful story that everyone believed in, game-changing new technologies, and crucially, enough stability that people had the mental space, this cognitive surplus, to actually innovate and create.
Now, I know this idea of coherence can feel a little out there, a little abstract. So the framework gives us this really powerful analogy to ground it in something we all know, the stock market.
And this just makes so much sense, doesn't it? A bull market with all that optimism and energy, that's a civilization at its peak, creative, unified, moving forward. And a bear market is just the opposite. It mirrors a society in decline, fragmented, distrustful, where things start to fall apart. And bubbles? Well, that's what happens when a society gets way too confident in one single idea. It just goes to show you, sentiment and stories don't just drive markets, they drive history. All right, so that brings us to the inevitable question. Where are we in this cycle? Right now? What does this framework say about our world today, especially in the age of social media?
If you look back, achieving that high coherence state, those golden ages, it always required one thing above all else: massive collective focus, a shared attention. And let's be honest, that has become an incredibly rare commodity in our world.
I mean, think about our modern technologies. They often work directly against that kind of deep focus. The source points out that the constant pings and notifications shatter our attention, the algorithms can push us further apart, and our single shared story splinters into millions of tiny micro-realities. The whole system is built to keep us engaged, not to build the kind of deep coherence that lets a civilization thrive. The framework has a name for this: down-frequency fragmentation.
But, and this is a huge but, this is where the story takes a wild turn, because a new, incredibly powerful variable is now in play. Something that might just rewrite all the rules of the game: artificial intelligence.
So what if AI could do the exact opposite of what we just described? What if, instead of fragmenting us, it could pull us together? The source suggests AI could be a kind of frequency elevator. It could boost our collective brain power, help stabilize information on a global scale, act as a filter for noise and misinformation, and just radically accelerate the pace of innovation. It could be the very tool that helps us achieve and maintain a state of high coherence for longer than any civilization in history.
And if that's possible, well, that leads us to a pretty mind-bending but profound vision for what the next chapter of human history might look like.
See, every single civilizational high, every golden age, every renaissance we've ever had was built on this, on biological, human thought. That was the engine.
But now, for the first time ever, we're adding this entirely new, powerful layer of artificial cognition into the equation.
And we're linking it all, the human and the artificial, together through planet-spanning networks. We are building an entirely new kind of thinking machine.
This fusion of human minds, AI, and global networks, it could trigger what the source calls a super-coherent phase. We're talking about a kind of planetary-scale cognition that would just dwarf anything we've ever seen before. The idea isn't just that AI helps us do old things better, it's that it fundamentally reshapes what's even possible for us to think and achieve as a species.
And that leaves us with the final, pretty provocative question for this whole series. If this model is right, if AI really can act as a frequency elevator, then are we, right now, in the process of consciously programming our own next, and maybe our greatest renaissance? The full framework, experiments, and extensions are detailed in the paper linked below.